speaker, Brittany is going to talk about her study using service dogs to assess paw preference and personality.
Alright, hi everyone, I'm Brittany Logan, and my study is called Service Dogs, Paws, and Personality. So my study took place at NEADS, which stands for National Education Association of Dog Services, and this is located in Princeton, Massachusetts. Here they train dogs for deaf people, veterans, physical disabilities, classroom dogs, therapy dogs, ministry dogs, children with disabilities, and autistic children, so a very wide variety. So my interest for service dogs sparked about 3 years ago when I became entwined with NEADS. I first began working there and conducted my internship there. And while I was doing studies on service dogs, I came across the valence-specific hypothesis. And this more so deals with humans, but it talks about types of emotions in relationships to hemispheres which control handedness. So more in depth, this hypothesis talks about negative emotions that are expressed related to the right hemisphere of the brain, controlling for the left hand. Positive emotions related to the left hemisphere, controlling for the right hand. So this sparked my question of, is there a relationship between paw preference and personality, specifically in service dogs? So the importance of a type of study like this is that it can raise awareness for paw preference, which could ultimately help in training for service dogs. Paw preference could also be an early indicator of personality traits in service dogs, as it's crucial to understand a dog's personality and capability of going through such intense training. Personality is also crucial to understand when matching for clients, so once the dog is done with the training, it's extremely crucial to understand that dog's personality in order to successfully match it to a person that's in need. So for some of the literature that I reviewed, a lot of the studies looked at paw preference or personality separately. There was really only one study by Schneider 2013 that compared paw preference and temperament. But in this case with temperament, this really induces fear stimuli, and when training service dogs, I wasn't going to be able to induce this type of situation of fear into these dogs. A lot of my studies that I looked into also were about domesticated dogs and not service dogs in particular. One study that I did find, though, looked at service dogs and how they have low reactivity scores, high sociability scores, and curiosity scores. So these are some of the desired behaviors that we're looking for in service dogs. Another study I looked at found that the difference in strength in paw preference could also be task dependent. So when looking at paw preference, I could also take this into consideration that paw preference may be a task dependent. A lot of the other studies had great discrepancy between if sexual hormones and gender actually play an influence in paw preference. And because there was such a great discrepancy, to eliminate this variable, the dogs that I looked at were actually not intact, meaning they were spayed or neutered. So to identify some of the gaps again in the literature that I reviewed, lots of discrepancy and inconsistency between paw preference and service dogs, but a lot of studies did look at personality in service dogs, which was greatly helpful. So for my hypothesis for this experiment, dogs showing a right paw preference, which is more associated with positive behaviors, will express high frequency of activity, exploration, and sociability, which are desired behaviors in service dogs. Dogs that prefer left paw preference will show more frequent behaviors of reactivity and submissiveness, which are less desired behaviors in service dogs. So for some of my predictions, I predicted that personality will differ between stranger versus familiar interactions, which is a component of my study, as I'll talk about later on. Behavior seen while with a familiar person can be seen as a baseline of behavior, since these dogs are more familiar and comfortable with these people. I also had a prediction that right-pawed service dogs will have a higher graduation rate and a higher success rate with their clients. So some of the subjects that I looked at were 11 black and yellow Labrador retrievers, all coming from Guiding Eyes, which is where NEADS gets most of their dogs to go into training. And these are just a couple of the dogs that I looked at. This is of course when they were puppies. When I actually did the experiment on them, they were about 6 months to a year old. All of these dogs were tested in the NEADS headquarter main kennel, and they come into this kennel either for evaluations, medical issues, or final training with the client. So this is why my sample size was so low, is because I could only look at the dogs that were in the main kennel. The rest of the dogs, which is probably around 120 dogs in the program, were actually in 9 different prison locations. And unfortunately, I couldn't go into those prison systems. each of these dogs were individually assessed for personality and for paw preference. So for my experimental methods, when I assessed personality, there were two different situations. There was a stranger situation and a familiar situation. So a stranger was defined as a neat staff member or volunteer that has little to no interactions with the dogs when they're in the kennel. A familiar person was a kennel attendant who regularly interacted with the dogs, but trainers were excluded from this since they have a different relationship and bond with the service dogs. So each one of these dogs went through both of these two situations. And these situations occurred in the hearing room. This is a room that is set up like an apartment-style room. It has couches, refrigerators, and a ton of dog toys. So when the dogs entered this room, it was considered free time, and this is when the dogs take off all their gear, and commands are not to be given to these dogs. At this point, they're considered a non-working dog. And of course, there's only one dog at a time per situation. So the observer was placed actually outside of the hearing room, right here, looking into the hearing room through a window, and I was always placed in one section of the window so I could decrease my interactions or any type of influence when I was observing. And these interactions occurred for 20 minutes, and I took my data via an ethogram. So on an ethogram, there was 4 categorized behaviors that I was looking at. Activity and exploration were grouped into one. Sociability, submissiveness, and reactivity. And under each 4 of these categorized behaviors, I have the sub-behaviors that I was recording. I used a continuous recording method where each of the tallied sub-behaviors were marked per minute for 20 minutes of the interaction. So each dog actually received 2 ethograms, one for the familiar and one for the stranger. So my other experimentals for determining paw preference, I used 2 tests. One was the Kong test, seen in the left picture over here. This is when the dog was in the kennel and we give the dog a frozen Kong that's stuffed with frozen food. And when the dog first places their paw on that Kong, that is the first paw that I would record. The next test was the first step test, and this is when the dog again is in their kennel, getting dressed, they're given the command to sit, and then when they're given the command to be released from that, the first step that they took out of their kennel was also recorded. So per test there was 5 trials, so altogether there is 10 paw preference trials for each dog. So for my stats, I used a one-way RM ANOVA for both the Kong test and the first step test. And I also used something very interesting that I found in a lot of the literature. It's called laterality index, which can determine paw strength and direction. So the SR represents the right paw use and the SL represents the left paw use. When I was looking at personality scores correlated to paw preference, I used Spearman correlation, which is a non-barometric alternative. And so for my results, here we can see the laterality index of each individual dog and their scores for both the Kong test and for the first step test. So the closer to a positive 100 means that a right paw use and 100 being the highest strength of that paw use. Closer to negative 100 is a left paw, and again 100 indicating the strongest, or the greatest strength. And actually, as you can see here, there are 3 dogs that have the highest strength of 100, and interestingly enough, these 3 dogs are actually related. Unfortunately, my sample size was much too small to find a correlation or relationship between the 2, but certainly interesting for future research. And unfortunately, there was no significant correlations found between paw preference and personality. But what I did find was positive and negative correlations between the behavior seen in the dog and the person that was present in the hearing room with that dog. So as we can see here on the first graph, a diamond represents an individual dog. In the first graph here, we have a stranger situation. On the X and Y axis, it shows the behavioral scores of the dogs, what they received. On the X-axis, we can see social scores, and on the Y-axis, we can see activity scores. So what this graph is depicting is that as the dog has high activity levels, it's correlated with high social scores. So as the dog is being active with the stranger, they're also being very social with the stranger. In graph number 2, I'm correlating stranger and familiar situations and looking at the behavior of submissiveness. So on the X-axis, we can see stranger submissive scores, and on the Y-axis, we can see familiar submissive scores. And this is meaning that as the dogs score low submissive scores while with their familiar person, they're also scoring low submissive scores while with a stranger. Again, the same thing as the outliers out here, as they're scoring high submissive scores with a familiar person, again, they're scoring high submissive scores while with a stranger. So this is meaning that the dogs are actually very personable and they're not changing their submissive behaviors between a stranger and a familiar. So these next two graphs are looking at just stranger situations. On the x-axis on graph number 3, we can see stranger reactive scores. Y-axis, we see stranger activity scores. As the dogs are being active with a stranger, we're seeing a decrease in reactivity. And this is what we want to see in service dogs, is decreased reactivity and higher activity. Again, in the last graph, number 4, we can see, again on the x-axis, stranger reactivity, the y-axis, stranger social scores. And this means as there is a higher social score, there is a lower reactivity score. Again, very important that reactivity scores are low, social scores are high. So in conclusion, there was really no significant findings between paw preference and personality, but what I did find was that stranger interactions are actually helping to decrease unwanted service dog behaviors of reactivity and submissiveness. Also, these stranger situations are helping to show more frequent desired behaviors of activity and exploration, as well as sociability. Overall, these findings show that it's extremely important to have stranger interactions with service dogs in training, but also to have familiar people interact with these dogs. So as for my results in context to previous literature, Schneider 2013 reported that purebred dogs were reported to show less stranger aggression and fearful behaviors. And again, since I wasn't able to look at fearful behaviors or aggression, my research did show that there was a decrease in unwanted behaviors, or less desired behaviors in service dogs. So some confounds of my research, as I mentioned before, there was a small sample size. I could have used more testing trials on the first step test. Previous literature has shown that the first step test actually has higher lateralization scores compared to the con test, which is showing weaker lateralization scores. It would have been interesting to look at all the dogs if they're on the same training level in the program. The dogs that came into the needs kennel were about 6 months to a year old, so there was a bit of a variation in their training levels. Also, the strangers that were strangers were not actually considered strangers to needs. They were all volunteers or employees. They just were strangers to the dogs. They didn't interact with the dogs. So for some future directions, it would be interesting to look at related dogs, assessing the strength and direction of paw preference. Another study could look at paw preference in black, yellow, and chocolate labs and see if there's a significant difference in paw preference due to fur color overall due to genetics. And it'd also be extremely interesting